Alright, tonight we're diving into something surprisingly messy and complicated: dating during the Middle Ages. And no, it wasn't all night singing love songs and ladies swooning from balconies. It was a world where finding love was tangled up with livestock deals, chaperones, and survival. Honestly, compared to that, a 2 a.m. "what you doing?" text almost seems classy. Before we really get into it, go ahead and like the video and subscribe if you're into this kind of thing. Drop a comment too, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Always cool to see how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Okay, lights down, maybe a little background hum from a fan, and let's take a quiet walk back through time. You're in a medieval village, or maybe a cold stone castle, thinking about how people found love back then. Well, they didn't. At least, not in the way we think of it now. Flirting, dating, texting back and forth just to see where it goes? Forget all that. In this world, it's not about love stories. It's about deals, arranged marriages made by parents, lords, or even abbots. Who you marry isn't up to you, and how many cows are involved matters more than your feelings. If you were born into a noble family, chances are your marriage was decided when you were still learning to walk straight. You'd meet your future spouse maybe once, on your wedding day. Romance? It's all about land, titles, and political alliances. How well someone plays the lute won't win them any points if they don't come with property attached. Down among the peasants, things were a bit more relaxed, but only slightly. Love still wasn't the focus. Your family might know a girl whose parents own a particularly fertile goat, or a boy who's good at fixing roofs without breaking his neck. That's enough to start courting. Congratulations. It's not that people back then didn't feel romantic. They did. They just had to put it somewhere quiet, somewhere hidden. Love was something you dreamed about, maybe scribbled in a verse on some scrap of parchment. Maybe you caught someone's eye across a dusty market and let yourself wonder, just for a second. But acting on that feeling? That was dangerous. Falling in love before marriage was risky. Falling in love outside of marriage was scandalous. So you wait. You play your role. You definitely try not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because here, love is the poet's game. Marriage? That belongs to your parents, your priest, and the politics of the village. Say you do like someone. Maybe it's the way they balance a sack of onions just right. Or how confidently they beat the dust out of a rug. Your heart stirs, but hold on. Romance in the Middle Ages came with spreadsheets, not serenades. You had to ask yourself, what am I worth? Not emotionally, economically. If you were a young man, you'd need more than a winning smile. Land, livestock, tools, a house that mostly keeps the rain out. Those were your ticket to marriage. A love poem was fine, but 2 healthy oxen were better. And if you were a young woman, your family had to provide a dowry. That could mean coins, fabric, or a suspiciously large number of geese. How clever or kind you were didn't matter much if your parents couldn't pay. If your older brother already got the family's best goat, and there's nothing left for you, well, the church is always looking for new recruits. So while love was a sweet idea tucked into stories and songs, it rarely got to decide anything. In real life, it was deals, expectations, and the simple math of survival that ruled the heart. You've been perfecting your embroidery for hours, maybe days, sitting alone and letting the time pass. Then, finally, someone catches your eye, someone who somehow makes your tired, calloused heart skip a beat. You meet at the well, there's that spark, something tender and real. It feels like a moment from a poem. But in reality, it means nothing. Not unless your families are equally wealthy. If they're not, your little crush might as well be on a passing cloud. Things only get more complicated if you're noble. Your love life isn't yours to manage. It's tied to land deals and political alliances. You're not seen as a person. You're a living, breathing agreement. Even peasants don't get to follow their hearts. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for chemistry or charm. You marry because it makes sense. Maybe your goat fence lines up nicely with someone else's field. You dream about love, sure, but you marry for irrigation access. Still, you might try. Maybe you offer a token, a spoon you carved, a few berries, your best mug, even if it's a little chipped. Maybe they smile. Maybe they just walk away. But none of that changes the reality. In the Middle Ages, flirting meant figuring out if your fields matched up or if your goats were productive. Love was an extra, something you crossed your fingers for after the wedding. Now, maybe you're not a pigpen peasant or a noble stuck in land politics. Maybe you're a knight. Big horse, shiny armor, a sword in one hand and bad poetry in the other. What's love like for you? Welcome to the exhausting world of courtly love, a strange medieval mix of showmanship and suffering. This wasn't dating. It was more like emotional theater. Courtly love was a noble game, a tradition that combined admiration, frustration, and a total lack of practicality. As a knight, you'd choose a lady, usually a married one, and dedicate yourself to loving her from a safe emotional distance. No touching, no sneaking off for a chat behind the castle. Your job was to suffer gracefully. You'd write poems about her radiant smile or how her hair shines like the sun. Translation: she's decent looking and hasn't insulted your lineage. You wear her colors into battle, you sigh dramatically, and maybe you even challenge another knight to a duel just because he dared glance her way. The lady? She's supposed to act cold and unreachable, like a snowstorm that reads poetry. If you're lucky, she'll toss you a ribbon or maybe send a carefully worded note. Mostly, though, she keeps her distance. That's the whole point. Courtly love thrives on impossible longing. The moment it turns real, it stops being poetic and starts being a problem, one that could turn into a full-blown scandal or an accusation of adultery. But as long as everyone plays along and no one takes it too seriously, courtly love works. It lets knights express themselves, show off, and feel something deeper than battlefield rage, without shaking up the social structure. It was all pageantry and pain, more about the idea of love than the messy, unpredictable reality. Still, even in this over-the-top drama, expressing love was tricky. You couldn't just grab someone's hand and say how you feel. In that world, that kind of gesture was practically a formal declaration. So, people got creative. Dinner, the token. Tokens were basically medieval texts, just way slower and easier to misinterpret. If you couldn't get your poem through her confessor, you'd send her your glove. Or maybe you'd cut off a bit of your embroidered sleeve and have it delivered. Nothing says, "I'm yours," quite like sending someone part of your outfit. And if you were the one receiving it, congrats. You now own a slightly sweaty piece of someone's clothing and possibly a whole heap of confusing emotions along with it. You're handed a linen sleeve you never asked for, and now you're stuck trying to decode what it means. Is it a love confession? A favor request? A hint that you should be buying jewelry? No one knows, not even the person who sent it, half the time. Women gave tokens too, maybe a ribbon, a lock of hair, a little pendant. Romantic? Sure. But also risky. Send the wrong trinket to the wrong guy and suddenly you're unofficially promised to someone who drinks too much and smells like old cheese. Tokens were meant to be subtle, like a whispered secret pinned to your tunic. A glove tucked into a belt, a ribbon tied to a sword, everyone understood the meaning, but no one said it out loud. The vaguer, the better. It wasn't really about expressing love. It was about giving yourself enough room to deny you were expressing anything at all. This glove? Oh no, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared. On my pillow. Scented like lavender. Total mystery. For commoners, tokens were a bit rougher around the edges. Maybe a carved charm, or a handkerchief stitched in the 5 minutes between milking cows and mending boots. Still sweet. Still full of hope. Just with more dirt under the nails. But tokens came with risk too. Give one to the wrong person and you might set off a storm of gossip. Get one from someone you're not into? Now you've got to figure out how to return a stranger's sock without insulting their great-grandmother's honor. Even so, tokens mattered. They carried meaning in a world where love didn't get much space. These little objects held weight. They were fragile chances at affection in a system built around duty, status, and survival. So let's say you've finally worked up the nerve to talk to your crush. You've got a flower in your hand, maybe a line of poetry you didn't entirely steal from a minstrel. You're ready to make a move. But here's the catch, you're not alone. You're never alone. Welcome to medieval dating surveillance. Privacy? Doesn't exist. If you're a young woman, every outing is monitored. Fetching water? Your best friend and her terrifyingly judgmental aunt are coming too. Going for a stroll? Better bring 3 cousins and someone who needs. Someone is always watching. Usually your family, the priest, or the village busybody who hasn't blinked in 20 minutes. Trying to court someone as a man? Better have a solid game plan, and a backup blessing from her family, her priest, and half the town. Show up with flowers, and suddenly her dad's sharpening a blade behind the door, her mom's stirring a cold pot just to look busy, and the priest, for some reason, is passing by on his morning prayers at dusk. Why all the eyes? One reason: control. Protecting virtue, family reputation, and most of all, stopping any unsupervised touching. Before marriage, or during, forever, dating was more like a team sport, where the team is everyone you've ever met and their job is to supervise your emotions. Even group hangouts had rules. Sitting on a bench? Sure, if you're 2 meters apart and someone's grandmother is pretending not to listen while knitting aggressively. The church, naturally, had thoughts, lots of them. Courtship came with rules like it was a medieval nightclub. Priests gave sermons on flirtation, wrote long essays on proper behavior, and yes, even published manuals warning against eye contact that lingered too long. Even love letters weren't safe. Some monasteries opened and read them, just to check for anything morally questionable. It was divine censorship, God and a few monks judging your punctuation and your passion. So if you wanted to fall in love back then, you had to do it quietly. Preferably in a room full of family members, under the disapproving gaze of your priest, while pretending you were only interested in wool prices. Because in the medieval world, love wasn't private. It was public, scrutinized, and heavily patrolled. So you fall in love, or at least you think you do. The medieval version, anyway. A lot of glancing, a bit of longing, and hours of dramatic pacing by a window. You catch each other's eye across a crowded feast. Maybe they pick up your handkerchief and, miracle of miracles, they don't throw it straight into the fire. The air feels charged. There's something there. But of course, you can't say anything. Not directly. Not with mothers, priests, and chaperones hovering nearby like emotional customs officers. So what's left? You write a letter. Ah yes, the medieval love letter, the most dangerous piece of parchment since a papal excommunication. This is where you pour your heart out, as long as it's in riddles. You can't just say, "Hey, I like you." You have to say something like, "My soul is a stag, pierced by your radiant grace, forever lost in the forests of yearning." The more dramatic, the better. Assuming you can read and write, which wasn't exactly guaranteed, you'll scratch it out on parchment or vellum. Maybe you get fancy and dust it with flower petals or dab on a bit of perfume. Just don't overdo it. One noble famously wrapped a herring in his love letter by accident and gave it to the wrong girl. They're married now. Could have gone worse. Then there's the issue of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You'll need a go-between, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling who doesn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. If you're desperate, maybe even a minstrel. He'll sing your poem in the square and pretend it's anonymous, though whether that helps or horrifies depends on your rhyming skills. Of course, writing anything remotely romantic was risky. Step over the line. Just hint at something physical, and you're not just a flirt, you're a heretic. Suddenly you're in confession, trying to explain how your cheeks burn like the eternal fire wasn't meant to sound like eternal damnation. But people still wrote. Some letters survived. Some poems were passed around in secret, shared like contraband between heart-struck teens and lonely nobles. In a world with strict rules and constant watching, a tiny piece of folded paper could feel like freedom. So you take the chance. Your hand shakes as you press it to the page, whispering all the things you're not allowed to say out loud. Just maybe don't sign it too clearly. This is courtship, not an invitation to your own trial. Then, finally, a break from routine. A festival. A feast day. A spring dance. A rare moment when life isn't just farming, praying, or avoiding eye contact with the blacksmith's daughter. Today you're allowed to flirt, sort of. As long as everyone pretends not to notice. Welcome to the medieval festival, where romance tries to sneak through cracks in the rules while chickens run between your legs and your mother glares from across the field. These were one of the only times men and women could actually mingle, laugh, maybe even lock eyes in public. There's music. There's meat. There's someone in a flower crown who looks way too confident. Everyone's smiling, or at least not frowning. That alone is a miracle. If you're a peasant, you've got options. Win the sack race. Catch the greased pig. Try not to embarrass yourself while juggling 3 stale bread rolls. Impress your crush by falling off a hay bale with something that resembles grace. These things mattered. Dancing, though, that's the main event. It was your best shot at real contact. The rules were tight, but with a carefully timed turn or a totally accidental hand brush, you could say more than any letter ever could. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant flirtation machine, disguised as wholesome tradition and wrapped in ribbons of plausible deniability. And if you're noble, flirting looked a little cleaner, but not much less ridiculous. You might compose a line of verse on the spot, something about candlelit eyes or other glowy metaphors, and offer a token. With luck, it won't be obvious that your servant whipped it up 5 minutes ago. Food helped too. Offer them a meat pie, a sweet pastry, maybe a honey cake. If they smile and take it, things are going well. If they feed it to their dog, time to change targets. But whatever you do, however subtle or bold, just remember, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, the neighbor who hasn't blinked since sunrise. Because even in moments meant for joy, the medieval world didn't let love go unchaperoned. A bard with a loose tongue could ruin everything. One awkward glance or playful smile, and suddenly you're the subject of 6 weeks' worth of church gossip. But even so, for a brief window, maybe during a festival or a feast, you get to pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't just about property or status. Pretend laughter isn't suspicious. Pretend dancing doesn't end with a confession and some deeply uncomfortable penance. Now, let's say you're not a knight, not a noble, not even a bard with too many feelings and a lute. You're just a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, sleep when the chickens do, and spend your daylight hours ankle-deep in mud and responsibility. You're not out here searching for your poetic soulmate. You just want someone who can milk a goat without crying about it. This is peasant courtship, low-key, practical, and centered on one big question: can we survive the winter together? Romance here isn't candlelit declarations or stolen glances across ballrooms. It's noticing someone who works hard, doesn't whine, and has most of their teeth. That's the dream. You're not aiming for fireworks. You want someone who knows how to gut a fish and won't kick you in their sleep. So how do you say, "Hey, I like you," in this world? Small gifts, useful things, a basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a decent turnip. If you're really feeling brave, maybe a ribbon you braided yourself or a spoon you carved by candlelight while your pig stared at you, judging every whittle. Most conversations happen during chores. Maybe you walk together to the mill. Maybe you talk while herding sheep or while elbow-deep in something best left undescribed. No one's reciting sonnets here. You talk about the weather, harvest rumors, and whether old Thomas has managed to fall into the well again. And somehow, that's romantic in its own way. It's quiet, sincere, and built on the everyday. You get to know each other through teamwork, through laughter, frustration, and the occasional goat chase. You see strengths, weaknesses, and how they react when the barn catches fire. Proposals aren't grand events. If both parties agree and the families approve, you move forward. Marriage often follows quickly. Maybe you move into one of your family's homes. Maybe you build a small hut with help from neighbors. You bring a blanket. They bring a goat. Together, you begin the strange and hopeful experiment of shared survival. It's not glamorous, but it's real. You found someone who can cook, clean, put up with your family, and doesn't flinch at your feet. In medieval terms, that's basically true love. Now comes the marriage itself. But don't picture starlit vows and gentle music. This is business. A contract sealed in front of witnesses, often with all the charm of a barnyard. Auction. Even for peasants, it's a serious event. You gather a few friends, visit the priest, and try not to mangle the Latin too badly during the ceremony. Beneath the surface, though, lies a serious checklist. Who brings the dowry? Who gets what land? Who keeps the cow if someone drops dead during planting season? That's where the real romance lives, right between inheritance clauses and livestock negotiations. If you're part of the upper class, strap in, it gets even more intense. Your marriage is a legal merger dressed up as a social event. Parents on both sides negotiate terms. Priests, scribes, and possibly a cousin who once skimmed a law book all weigh in. The bride and groom? Mostly background decoration, they're to nod politely and not ruin the deal. You may not have even met the person you're marrying, but the numbers add up. Your debt, her dowry, the family coats of arms, they make a balanced ledger. Optional. A good alliance? Non-negotiable. And once you're married, that's it. There's no conscious uncoupling. Divorce isn't really on the table unless you can prove the other person was secretly your cousin, never baptized, or recently died without telling anyone. In short, marriage was binding, strategic, and nearly impossible to undo. Like duct tape, if duct tape also controlled land ownership and had the backing of the church. Annulments technically existed, but they were a hassle, stacked with paperwork, reliant on some luck, and more than likely a discreet bribe. Still, not everything about medieval marriage was bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to care for each other, sharing chores, raising children, getting through long winters together. Those things had a funny way of building affection. Or, at the very least, mutual tolerance. And in medieval terms, that basically was love. The church, of course, had its hands in everything. Marriage wasn't just a social or legal arrangement. It was a sacrament, one of the big seven. You didn't get married because it was convenient. You got married because God was watching, possibly taking notes. So you'd say your vows, smile politely, and someone would hand over a sack of onions as if it were a divine blessing. And honestly, that was normal. But now let's flip things around. Let's say you're tired of all the contracts, the negotiations, the feeling of being treated like a particularly elegant bag of flour. You're a noble, and for once in your life, you just want to marry for love. Not for land. Not for politics. Just love. Well, congratulations. You've just declared war on your own family. Eloping as a noble was the social equivalent of setting your family tree on fire and roasting marshmallows in the flames. It wasn't just personal, it was political sabotage. Let's say your Lady Ellalinina promised to Lord Subering von Secure for the sake of borders and balanced budgets. But your heart belongs to a penniless squire who smells like horse sweat and freedom. You meet in secret, whisper ridiculous poetry in the stables, and one night you vanish. You run to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor, and there you marry, legally questionable, emotionally thrilling, with a shaky monk and two mildly confused chickens as your witnesses. Back home? Chaos. Your father's threatening to burn down your husband's family herb garden. Your mother's weeping into her embroidery. The church is scandalized. The gossip is chef's kiss. And your new husband? He's realizing that love may not protect his kneecaps. Best case scenario, he gets to keep you and live quietly. Worst case? Excommunication, followed by a painfully dramatic death. Possibly in reverse order. Still, some couples pulled it off. If the families couldn't undo the marriage without looking even more foolish, they'd sometimes just accept it, grumble a bit, and move on. After all, what's done is done, and hey, nobody died. Hopefully. These rebellious love stories, rare as they were, sometimes became legend. Songs were sung, poems were penned, stories whispered at noble feasts. Two people choosing love over duty? Practically mythic. Most noble marriages were transactions, yes. But every now and then, someone dared to make it about passion, not paperwork. And for a fleeting moment, people remembered that love, messy, inconvenient, scandalous love, still existed. So next time you swipe left or turn down a second date because someone chose weirdly, just take comfort. At least your romantic decisions don't involve a secret wedding, an enraged baron, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage. That beautiful bond between two souls and their carefully balanced financial assets. In the Middle Ages, love was sweet. But a solid dowry? Now that was romance. If you were a bride, you weren't just marrying, you were being launched into married life like a mobile economic package. Your family prepared your dowry with care, money, livestock, land, linens, and if your charm rating was high enough, maybe even a cow or two. Feeling extra generous? Some pewter dishes might get thrown in. These offerings didn't go into storage, they went straight to your new husband. He accepted you and your bundled assets with a warm smile and a mental checklist of how useful everything would be. But in some cultures, the system flipped. Instead of the bride's family giving wealth away, it was the groom who paid the bride price. A formal thank you to her family for raising someone capable of bearing heirs and managing a household without burning it down. Either way, it was money moving to make marriage happen, and feelings were always secondary to the spreadsheets. Them alone, especially not while trying to haul water through the snow or keep 12 goats from eating the roof. Maybe your first marriage ended in disaster, or just in mutual silence and separate sleeping arrangements. But now, here you are. A widow. The grief may be real, but so is the strange little window of freedom that opens up with it. Especially if you're a woman, suddenly you can own land, make decisions, and speak without being waved into silence by some cousin with a mustache and too many opinions. You're not entirely free, of course. Society still had opinions. Mourning periods were expected, especially if you were seen weeping less and smiling more. But people also understood survival. A widow with land and no husband? That's not just independent, that's valuable. Suitors showed up fast. Some with honest intentions. Others just really into your dairy cow situation. Men didn't get much time to mourn either. If your wife died, society all but shoved you back into marriage. 11 kids don't raise themselves, and that soup isn't going to stir on its own. So, you started looking, maybe the baker's daughter who's been giving you extra rolls, maybe the quiet widow at market who sells suspiciously good meat. Second marriages had their own flavor. A little more worn in, a little more real. This time around, you weren't 16 and being traded for acreage. You were older, probably missing a few teeth, and looking for someone who wouldn't let the goats inside during storms. Romance wasn't dead, it was just more practical. Love grew not from sonnets but from shared chores and mutual back pain. Of course, it wasn't all smooth. The church didn't love it when people remarried too quickly, like, the body isn't cold yet quickly. And there were often awkward inheritance talks, especially for widows. Nothing like falling in love again while also fighting your late husband's brother over who gets the butter churn. Still, remarriage was normal. Expected even. Life was short, winters were brutal, and loneliness wasn't something most people had the luxury to indulge for long. Marriage, first, second, or even third, wasn't just about love. It was about survival, support, and having someone to help patch the roof before the next storm hit. So yes, medieval marriage could be disappointing, suffocating, or comically transactional. But it could also be practical, comforting, even unexpectedly sweet. Because in a world full of cold stone, muddy paths, and hard days, sometimes love didn't come in like a song. Sometimes, it just showed up with a basket of eggs and stayed to help with the goats. Even if half the details are fuzzy, the legend of Tomarus still roars across the centuries. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We were talking about medieval love, messy, unpredictable, occasionally celestial. Because yes, love was part of it all. Not the swooning, lute-playing, love-at-first-sight kind most of the time, but the quiet kind. The kind built on mutual stories, shared struggles, and that knowing glance between two people who've seen life at its worst and still decided to keep going. So you light the fire, pour the soup, try again. Not because love is perfect, but because it's real. And after everything, the contracts, the awkward courtships, the chaperoned walks, and possibly a moonlit barn escape, you're still standing, still hopeful. But before you leap into something new, there's one final medieval checkpoint you've got to clear. Are you even cosmically allowed to love this person? In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just about feelings. It was about fate, stars, and suspicious omens. Astrology played a real role. You didn't just fall in love. You consulted the monk who read star charts. Were your signs aligned? Was Venus throwing a tantrum? Was your beloved born during a blood moon while Mercury sulked in retrograde? Better check, because nothing ruins a romance faster than cursed planetary alignments. Birthmarks could also raise eyebrows. Some believed these were divine symbols, proof you were either destined to be together or destined to kill each other. Interpretations varied wildly. And the church? It had rules. So many rules. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin unless you paid for a fancy piece of paper called a dispensation. And the rich? They paid a lot. Which explains the tangled family trees and why some nobles practically had to carry around flowcharts before proposing. Social class mattered too. A noble falling for a peasant? Scandalous. Forbidden. Only acceptable if the story ended in heartbreak and was later sung by sad people with mandolins. Then came the omens. Drop bread while thinking about someone? Cursed love. Raven flies overhead during your daydream? Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep, maybe to protect you from heartbreak, maybe to stop you from stealing someone else's butter-churned spouse. Either way, magic was always watching. Love wasn't private. It was personal, yes, but also mystical. The stars had opinions. The saints had opinions. The wind had opinions. And so did that slightly odd woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she kind of was. And yet, despite all that, despite the warnings, the rules, the tangled family trees, people still loved. Often clumsily. Sometimes recklessly. Always imperfectly. Because even in a world ruled by contracts, omens, and stern monks with quills, the heart stayed gloriously disobedient. Now, back to Tomyris. You've heard of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Cyrus the Great. But how about the queen who, according to legend, chopped off Cyrus's head and dunked it in a bucket of blood? Her name was Tomyris. She didn't rule from a marble palace or behind golden gates. Her court was the open sky. Her throne? A saddle. Her power came not from birthright alone, but from the kind of unshakable authority that made hardened warriors follow her without hesitation. Tomyris led the Massilians, a fierce group of nomadic tribes from the Central Asian steppes. Think tattooed warriors, endless horseback migrations, ritual feasts, and justice dealt in full view of the gods and the wind. She wasn't handed power through a web of court advisors or noble alliances. She earned it. Through battle, leadership, and what we can only assume was an incredible glare. Her people were survivors, tough, weathered, and constantly at war. And even among them, Tomyris stood out. No husband overshadowed her. No brother whispered advice in her ear. She was the decision-maker, the war leader, the lawgiver. In a time when women were often sidelined or silenced, she rode at the front. Most of what we know comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian who had a tendency to blend fact with dramatic flair. But even if the details are fuzzy, the story of Tomyris still holds power. Whether legend or truth, or a bit of both, her legacy reminds us that love, leadership, and defiance can survive even the harshest landscapes. Gathered their warriors, painted their faces, and prepared their horses. The air before battle was thick, not just with the scent of leather and sweat, but with something deeper, fury sharpened by loss. Tomyris wasn't just commanding an army, she was leading a storm made of rage, grief, and the will of a mother with nothing left to lose. Cyrus had miscalculated. He expected submission, maybe resistance, but not this. Not a queen who had lost her son and now burned with purpose. Not a people who saw battle not as politics, but as sacred duty. The Massagetes didn't march for conquest. They rode for justice. The battle that followed was brutal. Herodotus claims it was one of the bloodiest of the ancient world. Tomyris' forces clashed with the Persian army in a violent, chaotic storm of arrows, blades, and unrelenting resolve. The Persians, disciplined and expansive, were overwhelmed by a fury they hadn't prepared for. And Cyrus? The legend says he fell in that battle. The great conqueror, the man who took Babylon, who built one of the largest empires in history, was cut down by a queen of the steppe. But Tomyris wasn't finished. Victory wasn't enough. She found his body on the battlefield, and in an act soaked in symbolism and raw vengeance, she took his head and, as promised, dunked it in a bag of blood. "You thirsted for blood," she said, "so drink your fill." Was it literal? Maybe. Herodotus was never one to shy away from the dramatic. But even if embellished, the point still stands. Thamyris had done what no one else could. She stopped an empire with grit, strategy, and the terrifying power of a mother's grief. She didn't ask to be remembered. She didn't rule for glory. But her story, half history, half myth, still echoes centuries later. A reminder that power doesn't always come from crowns or courts. Sometimes it comes from the wind, from the plains, and from a woman who refuses to be broken. Thamyris wasn't just a queen. She was a warning. War drums didn't echo through the mountains, and no polished ranks of soldiers marched in unison. Instead, they came like thunder, hundreds of warriors thundering across the plains on horseback. Leather armor clung to them, their faces streaked with war paint, weapons in hand, bows, spears, blades. This wasn't a Persian army. It was something wilder, faster, and more unpredictable. Deadly in its chaos. This time, Thamyris wasn't reacting, she was leading. She'd learned from her enemy. Cyrus the Great, perhaps too proud after tricking her once before, walked straight into her trap. She'd watched, waited, studied his every move. And when the time was right, she let her fury fly. The two sides collided in a brutal, bloody clash. Herodotus would later call it one of the deadliest battles of the ancient world. There were no clever maneuvers or grand speeches. Just raw violence, screaming horses, swords meeting flesh, warriors fighting with everything they had. And there, right in the middle, was Thamyris herself. She wasn't a queen wrapped in silk, issuing orders from a distance. She fought alongside her people, cutting down enemies with unflinching determination. When the dust cleared, Cyrus the Great lay dead. His body was searched, and his head was cut off, stuffed into a wineskin full of blood. According to legend, Thamyris looked at it and said, "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." Maybe the details are a little fuzzy, maybe Herodotus added some drama. But the point remains, Thamyris won. She destroyed the mightiest empire of her time. She avenged her son. And she ensured that her name would not be remembered as that of a grieving mother, but of a fierce leader who couldn't be broken. On that battlefield, as the Persians scattered and their king lay motionless, Thamyris didn't raise her arms in triumph. There was no victory parade, no coins bearing her face, no new capital carved from the dust. She simply stood over the man who had taken her son from her. She had justice, but not peace. The impact of Cyrus's death didn't stay on that field. Word of it rushed across the ancient world, to Babylon, to Egypt, to the furthest edges of the Persian Empire. The invincible king had fallen, not to another empire, but to a nomadic queen with no crown, no palace, just grit, grief, and a cavalry loyal to the end. But Thamyris didn't use the moment to grab more. She didn't ride for conquest. She went home. No new taxes. No empire building. She wasn't interested in ruling Persia. Her mission was done. Her people were safe. Her son was avenged. The empire would survive, but now it would think twice before riding east again. What makes her story even more extraordinary is what didn't happen next. Most rulers, after such a win, would have seized power, claimed new lands. But Thamyris didn't. Her goal wasn't glory, it was freedom. She protected what mattered and left the rest behind. And then she vanished. No monuments. No tomb. No statues. After the battle, her trail fades. She slips into the fog of history, wild and free, like the land she ruled. Some say Herodotus got it wrong, that Cyrus died elsewhere, that the blood-filled wineskin was just a story. Maybe so. But even the doubters admit, someone brought Persia to its knees. And it wasn't a general. It wasn't a king. It was a mother. A queen. A woman whose heartbreak turned into a reckoning that would echo for centuries. Her legend didn't need to be carved in stone. It lived in stories carried by the wind. And if you listen closely, they say you can still hear her name in the howl of the steppe. To understand her, you have to understand her people. The Massages weren't builders of cities or sculptors of temples. They lived on horseback, in open skies and wild lands. And they followed a queen who fought not for glory, but for love. No gardens full of poems or scrolls. The Massages weren't builders of monuments. They were a warrior people, always on the move, living in the wild lands east of the Caspian Sea. Lands too vast, too unpredictable for Persian governors or Babylonian scholars to control. Their world ran on freedom, movement, and fierce loyalty. Their home wasn't a city, but endless open plains. There were no borders, just the wind, the sky, and herds of horses and cattle, which acted as their wealth. Kids learned to ride before they could walk straight. Archery wasn't some special skill, it was just part of growing up. Their bows were short, lethal, and made for shooting on horseback. Their armor was layered with leather and scale, strong enough to survive battle, but flexible enough for speed. They lived by raiding, hunting, and defending what was theirs. And unlike many of the societies around them, women weren't just allowed to fight, they were expected to. A woman riding into battle wasn't a symbol or an exception. It was normal. That's why, when Tamiris led her people with a sword in hand, no one blinked. She wasn't stepping outside her role, she was filling it completely. Just smarter, tougher, and more dangerous than most. Their values were built around strength, yes, but also justice. Crime didn't go unpunished, but punishments were measured. Property wasn't always personal, it was often shared within the tribe. Loyalty mattered more than riches. And their leaders, whether kings or queens, didn't rule by bloodline alone. They had to prove themselves, through action, not birthright. Spiritually, they looked to the sun. Tamiris, in her warning to Cyrus, swore by it. For the Massages, the sun was more than a light in the sky. It was life, fairness, and judgment. It watched over their oaths, and breaking your word wasn't just a lie, it was an offense against the heavens. Tamiris wasn't a one-of-a-kind outlier. She was exactly the kind of leader her people admired. She didn't lead in spite of being a woman. She led because she embodied everything they stood for. Where Persia had hierarchy and systems, the Massages had freedom and will. And when the two forces clashed, it was that will, the refusal to submit, that held the line. Because if you grow up in a place where the wind never stops and there's nothing above you but sky, being conquered simply isn't an option. But here's the strange part. Everything we know about Tamiris, her son's death, her brutal revenge, that infamous wineskin full of blood, comes from a single source, Herodotus. He's often called the father of history. But he's also, quite fairly, called the father of wild tales. Herodotus loved a good story. And the more dramatic, the better. Bloody heads, revenge odes, and queens fueled by grief? That was his bread and butter. He didn't witness any of it firsthand. He relied on second-hand accounts, traveler gossip, and whatever he could gather from Persian rumors. For Herodotus, history wasn't just about facts. It was about performance. And still, he chose to tell her story. In a world full of kings and tyrants, he gave center stage to a warrior queen from the steppe who brought down one of the most powerful rulers on earth. That says something. So why did this story survive? Why did it spread so far, last so long? Because it had everything. A brave mother, a dead son, a clever trap, and a bloody end straight out of a Greek tragedy. If you heard that story told by a bard in a tavern in Athens or Thebes, you wouldn't forget it. Not because she ruled an empire, but because she beat one. As time passed, her legend shifted. In the Middle Ages, they painted her as a savage Amazon. In the Renaissance, artists imagined her soaked in blood, Cyrus's head raised high like a prize. She became a myth, part terror, part triumph. A symbol of defiance. A woman who dared, and won. For all the drama, for all the retellings over centuries, there's something in Tamiris' story that feels solid. Maybe not every line she supposedly said, maybe not the wineskin full of blood, but the foundation, the mother, the loss, the battle, the revenge, feels too personal, too real, to be completely made up. Herodotus didn't just record her tale. He transformed her into a legend. That might blur what's true and what's dramatized, but it also guaranteed something powerful. Her name would outlive Cyrus's official decrees. History has a habit of forgetting generals and governors, but it remembers stories of vengeance, especially when a queen is at the center of them. Tomyris, who left no surviving city or inscription, ended up haunting the imaginations of empires long after her people disappeared from the map. For more than 2,000 years, artists couldn't get enough of her. During the Renaissance, she became a favorite subject, bloody, bold, unforgettable. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly cradling a severed head while a court watched in stunned silence. In another, she presides over a ceremonial dunking of Cyrus's decapitated head into a vessel of blood. Tasteful? Not exactly. But unforgettable? Absolutely. To European painters and writers, she wasn't just a historical figure. She was a symbol, a canvas of meaning. To some, she was righteous fury made flesh. To others, a noble barbarian delivering brutal justice. Depending on the storyteller, she could be a feminist icon, a warning against female rule, or a tragic mother who refused to bow. Her image shifted with each interpretation, but it never faded. Writers were drawn to her too. In the Enlightenment era, she showed up in plays, novels, and debates. Philosophers argued over her legacy. Was she proof that women could govern? With wisdom and strength? Or a cautionary tale about what happens when passion overtakes reason? Either way, she remained part of the conversation. And yet, strangely, her own people left no written trace of her. The Massagetê faded into history, overtaken or absorbed by other nomadic cultures. No stone carvings, no burial mounds with plaques saying, Tomyris stood here. Every word we have about her comes from outside sources. And still, she wouldn't go away. In the Soviet era, Central Asia brought her back into focus. Statues of her went up in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. She was reimagined, not as a barbarian queen, but as a national symbol, a leader who stood up to empire. Scholars began to study her seriously, not as a myth, but as a political figure. A ruler, a strategist, a woman with real power. Today, she exists everywhere from academic journals to video games. One moment she's a character leading armies in a strategy title, the next she's being cited in research on women and leadership. That's range. And here's the irony, we don't even know what she looked like. No busts, no coins, no statues from her own time. But we know what she stood for: power, revenge, independence, and memory. In a world that forgets the quiet queens, Tomyris is remembered because she wasn't quiet. She didn't ease her way into history, she stormed into it, sword in hand, and left it blood-stained. She wasn't the first woman to lead in battle, and she definitely wasn't the last. But history tends to treat women like her as one-offs, brief sparks in a world ruled by men. That's just not the truth. Long before Tomyris, there was Shemuramet, the Assyrian queen who inspired the legend of Semiramis. She was said to have built cities, crushed rebellions, and ruled with a firm hand. Around the same time, the Scythians, close relatives of the Missae, buried female warriors with weapons, their skeletons showing the marks of real battle. These weren't ceremonial decorations. These women fought. They bled. They died. And after Tomyris came more. Boudica, the Celtic queen, led a fiery rebellion against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. Her story echoes Tomyris in many ways. Another mother, another empire, another fight to the death. Her story began with loss, deep, personal, and unforgivable. Her daughters were violated, her land stolen. In response, she didn't weep. She burned Roman settlements to the ground. That was Boudica. The echoes between her and Tomyris are striking. Vengeance. A towering empire too arrogant to imagine a woman striking back. Then there was Zenobia, queen of Palmyra. In the 3rd century CE, she stood against Rome too. Not with whispers or diplomacy, but with full defiance. She declared independence, printed coins with her own face, and forced the emperor to come to her. She carved out a kingdom with confidence, not apology. What connects all of them, Tomyris included, isn't just raw power. It's nerve, audacity. These were women who led when the world insisted leadership wasn't meant for them. And they didn't lead quietly or cautiously. They ruled as commanders, as tacticians, as sovereigns who dared to make kings bleed. History hasn't always been kind to them. While male conquerors are remembered with respect, these women were called unnatural, dangerous, even monstrous. Because they won. Thamyris wasn't some isolated anomaly. She was part of a pattern that spans continents and centuries, a global thread of women who rose up in moments of crisis and didn't back down. Her tale, filtered through Greek accounts and centuries of retelling, isn't just about military brilliance. It's about how stories survive. Even with no palace, no golden inscriptions, no engraved tomb or marble statue, Thamyris remains. Her entire legacy rests on a few fragments from Herodotus, biased, theatrical, and possibly fictional. And yet, they sparked something that never went out. Her name has lived for more than 2,000 years, resurfacing whenever the world needed to be reminded that real power doesn't always wear a crown or have a throne. In Renaissance Europe, she was painted as a noble savage, a dramatic figure in a blood-soaked tale. In modern Central Asia, she's a national hero. Statues of her stand in public squares. Schoolchildren learn her name. Politicians invoke her strength when calling for unity or defiance. But behind all the symbolism and retellings, what endures is something deeply human. Her story is about a mother grieving her son. A ruler with no safe path forward. Someone who stood at a crossroads and chose to fight, against overwhelming odds, and won. And in a world that often buries women like her under silence or footnotes, Thamyris remains. She's the blade just beneath the surface. The name that won't stay buried. She reminds us that history isn't only built by kings and dynasties. It's written in blood and sorrow, in vengeance and courage, in moments when everything is on the line and someone decides they will not break. There's something almost sacred in that final image, not of a parade or a coronation, but of a woman standing alone after the battle, surrounded by silence and death, knowing the world will doubt her story, but that she's changed it anyway. That is her legacy. Not the monuments she never built, but the fact that no one has been able to erase her. She doesn't need a statue. Her name still rides on the wind across the steppe. Her story still rattles the bones of empires. Her legend still carries that warning, "Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood." So the next time you hear of a great king's fall, remember, it's not always another crown that strikes the final blow. Sometimes, it's a queen on horseback, written off by history, but never gone. And if you were to live as she did, your walls wouldn't be stone, they'd be felt. Your roof would be stitched from hide. And your door? It would open to the endless horizon. No cities. No borders. Just sky. And freedom. No farmlands to till. No stone monuments to leave behind. Just the beat of hooves, the rustle of grass, and a sky that never looked the same 2 days in a row. For the ancient nomads, nothing was fixed, because permanence wasn't the goal. Strength came from movement. From the windswept Eurasian steppes to the dry stretches of the Arabian desert, nomadic cultures helped shape entire civilizations, without ever laying a brick temple or carving their history into stone. They weren't chaotic wanderers. They moved with intention, following the seasons, the needs of their herds, and the shape of the land. Their homes were not houses but yurts, tents, and wagons, portable, collapsible, and built for the road. Livestock was their currency: cattle, goats, sheep, and above all, horses. Horses were everything: transportation, weaponry, status symbol. To ride well was to survive. To ride better than everyone else? That made you a leader. But being nomadic didn't mean they lived in chaos. Their societies were structured, tight-knit networks of clans and tribes. Leadership wasn't handed down automatically through bloodlines. It had to be earned. A chief or khan could rise through skill in battle, powerful speech, or sheer presence. Loyalty wasn't given to titles. It was given to people, built around fires, tested in war. They weren't cut off from the rest of the world either. Quite the opposite. They were the glue that held the ancient world together. Long before formal trade routes were drawn, nomads were already connecting distant corners of the earth. Silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and people from Europe all moved because of them. Their caravans were the arteries of early global exchange. And when trade failed, they didn't wait around. They raided, quickly, precisely, and with terrifying force. They didn't leave behind scrolls or stone tablets. Their history lived in memory, in songs, speeches, and stories. The law, the past, and the soul of a tribe could be held in the mind of one elder or bard. These weren't just tales around the fire. They were instruction manuals, political records, identity. Empires saw nomads as unpredictable, even dangerous. But to themselves, nomads were defenders of freedom, masters of change, and heirs to the open sky. Their ruins are few. Their impact is enormous. Before the Mongols ever galloped across Eurasia, there were the Scythians. Between the 9th and 2nd centuries BC, they controlled vast lands stretching from the Black Sea deep into Central Asia. The Greeks saw them as strange and savage horsemen. But the Scythians saw themselves as proud, fierce, and free. Their entire world revolved around speed and violence. Boys learned to ride before their legs had fully grown. Their weapons were designed for battle on the move, short bows perfect for shooting from horseback, curved swords, axes, and iron-tipped spears. And Scythian warriors weren't only men. Graves tell the story that the ancients only hinted at. Buried beneath their burial mounds, called kurgans, archaeologists have uncovered female skeletons laid to rest with weapons, their bones showing real battle wounds. These weren't ceremonial burials. These women had fought. They didn't leave behind cities. But the kurgans preserved something far richer: gold, embroidered clothes, ornate weapons, and tattooed skin that still holds ink thousands of years later. Their artwork, filled with swirling animals and sharp edges, spoke of a life connected to nature and to danger. Yet, the Scythians weren't just warriors. They traded, negotiated, and sometimes hired themselves out as soldiers. Along the Black Sea, they dealt with Greek colonies, exchanging furs, grain, and slaves for pottery, wine, and luxury goods. They weren't isolated, they were part of the ancient economy. And through it all, they kept moving. Because for them, history didn't need to be carved in marble. It just needed to be remembered. And as long as the wind still sweeps across the steppe, some stories never stop writing. Greek writers couldn't decide whether to admire or fear the Scythians. Herodotus wrote about their unusual customs, like drinking the blood of enemies or turning scalps into napkins. But he also spoke of their loyalty, their deep sense of justice, and their tight-knit kinship. Their religion was raw and deeply rooted in the natural world. They worshipped gods of war, fire, and fertility. Some ceremonies used cannabis smoke, others demanded the sacrifice of horses. Their spirituality wasn't about temples or scriptures. It was tied to movement, to land, to cycles. Sacred but never static. Eventually, though, the Scythians began to fade. Pressured by rival nomadic groups like the Sarmatians and hemmed in by expanding empires, their influence dissolved. But they didn't vanish without leaving their mark. They became the blueprint, the archetype of the steppe warrior. Swift, deadly, and unbound by borders. No kingdom, no capital, just a horse, a bow, and the horizon. They didn't write down their stories. But every time you see a silhouette of a mounted archer against the plains, that's their shadow. They were the storm before the empires came. While the Scythians ruled the grasslands, another nomadic legacy was being shaped far to the south. In the Arabian deserts, the Bedouins carved their story into the sand. They weren't just wanderers. They were survivors, engineers of endurance in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Their life moved slowly, shaped by the rhythms of the desert, by droughts and rainfall, grazing routes, and the positions of the stars. Their homes were black tents woven from goat hair, light, breathable, and made to be packed in minutes. Their camels, the ships of the desert, were everything: transport, nourishment, clothing, and wealth. Bedouin society revolved around the tribe. Loyalty to family and clan stood above all else. Honor, shuf, wasn't a vague concept, it was the very structure of life. An insult could ignite a generations-long feud. But generosity, was just as serious. A stranger could expect food, water, and safety for 3 days, no questions asked. Their warfare was built on precision and purpose. Raids, called gazu, were quick strikes, meant to seize goods and livestock without spilling unnecessary blood. Success brought status. Failure brought shame. For them, combat was less about conquest and more about reputation, survival, and prestige. But Bedouin culture wasn't all battle and sand. It thrived on poetry. Poets held power equal to warriors. Their verses kept history alive, honored heroes, and shamed rivals. Around fires under the stars, poems were passed down, word by word, line by line. Some poems were so revered they became law. Others became legend. Trade caravans crossed through Bedouin territory, carrying incense, spices, and silk. The Bedouins guided them, protected them, sometimes smuggled through them. They knew every trail, every hidden spring, every star that pointed the way. Their knowledge wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. Even as many Bedouins eventually moved into cities or joined growing empires, their identity held strong. The black tent still symbolizes their heritage. Their codes of honor still shape communities. They weren't just desert dwellers. They were the soul of the sands. And then, in the 13th century, the world watched a storm like no other explode out of Mongolia. The Mongols didn't invent nomadic power, but they perfected it. In just a few decades, they created the largest connected land empire in history. But their beginnings were like so many others: hard, mobile, tribal, and deeply rooted in survival. Life on the Mongolian steppe was relentless. Freezing winters, dry summers, no cities, just grasslands, animals, and wind. The Mongols lived in gurs, circular felt tents that could be taken down, packed up, and moved in under an hour. Their herds, horses, yaks, goats, sustained them entirely, and their children learned to ride before they could read. Riding wasn't a skill, it was a necessity, a way of life. Before they ever learned to read, if they ever did, Mongol children learned to remember. Songs, sayings, and stories carried everything: history, knowledge, warnings, and values. Most Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need books. Memory was the library, and the language of the steppe was spoken in proverbs and passed down around the fire. What truly set the Mongols apart wasn't just their speed, it was how they used it. Under Genghis Khan, the old tribal loyalties were broken apart and reshaped into a new system built on merit. Loyalty wasn't owed to a tribe anymore, it was owed to the Khan. And that simple shift changed the world. Mongol warfare became an art of motion and misdirection. Their horse archers could ride full speed and still hit targets with deadly accuracy. They faked retreats to lure enemies into traps. They could move more than 100 miles in a single day. But this wasn't reckless raiding. It was strategy. Behind the chaos were scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological tactics honed to perfection. And when they turned their attention to cities, they didn't hesitate to adapt. Chinese and Persian engineers were brought into their armies. Soon, the Mongols were using catapults, flaming arrows, and siege towers with chilling efficiency. They were quick learners, and ruthless ones. But here's the twist most miss: they weren't just destroyers. The Mongol Empire connected more of the world than any force before them. They reopened and protected the Silk Road, making it safer than ever for trade, travel, and exchange. Ideas, goods, and unfortunately, diseases like the Black Death flowed along these routes. They created systems of paper money, diplomatic passports, and practiced a surprising level of religious tolerance. A merchant, a monk, and a priest could all travel safely, so long as they didn't defy the Khan. Even as rulers, they stayed nomads at heart. Mongol leaders might govern empires, but they still returned to their yurts, to their horses, to the endless sky. Cities could be conquered, but they never fully captured the Mongol spirit. No matter how far they went, they remained people of the wind. To settled empires, nomads were unpredictable, helpful when it suited them, threatening when it didn't. But for the nomads, the line between trade and raid was fluid. One day, they might escort your caravan through the desert. The next, they might raid your border town. It depended on the payment, the season, or even just how they felt about your last deal. Trade was essential to nomadic life. They didn't produce grain, pottery, or textiles. But they had things the empires wanted: livestock, furs, leather, salt, prized horses, even trained falcons. Some dealt directly with cities. Others acted as go-betweens, linking far-flung regions along trade routes like the Silk Road and the Incense Route. These weren't harmless traders, though. They traveled in armed caravans, prepared to defend or attack as needed. A tribal leader might shake hands with a border governor on Monday and raid his warehouse by Friday. Empires called this betrayal. Nomads called it keeping their options open. The Scythians, for instance, traded grain and gold with Greek cities on the Black Sea. But if a city tried to cheat them, they didn't argue, they burned it down. The Bedouins guarded incense and spice caravans across Arabia, unless someone skipped the protection fee. Then the camels turned around. The Mongols tried diplomacy too, at first. They sent merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire, hoping to open trade. When those merchants were executed, the Mongols responded by wiping out entire cities. To nomads, trade was never just business. It was a test of respect. Treat them as equals and commerce flourished. Treat them with contempt, and the retribution was swift and on horseback. This delicate balance created a unique kind of frontier life. Border towns became hybrid spaces, part marketplace, part fortress. Governors bribed nomadic leaders for peace. Traders hired bodyguards. Everyone walked a fine line, knowing that prosperity and devastation could arrive on the same wind. Nomads didn't just survive at the edges of empires. They shaped them. And the world bent to their rhythm, even when it pretended not to. Chieftains and tribes didn't just trade goods, they traded news, horses, and intelligence. Sometimes even arranged marriages were used to forge fragile truces. This constant back and forth between trade and raid wasn't a flaw in the nomadic way of life. It was intentional. It gave nomads power without needing to build or occupy cities. They could pressure empires, shape borders, and steer politics, all while staying mobile in a world obsessed with walls. They didn't need to take cities. They just needed cities to keep an eye on the horizon. But in a world without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, how do you preserve your past? For nomadic cultures, the answer was simple and profound. You remember it. Oral tradition wasn't a form of entertainment. It was everything. Their archive, their law, their identity. From the Scythian grasslands to the Mongolian plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory was sacred. Elders weren't just old, they were living archives. They carried lineages going back generations, remembered battles that shaped their people, and recited proverbs that guided both peace and war. Stories weren't optional. They were instructions. In Bedouin culture, poetry was the heart of everything. A powerful verse could shame a rival, praise the dead, or even end a dispute. Poets, Khalqi, were more than entertainers. They were advisors, historians, and public figures. Some were remembered longer than the chiefs they served. Their words had weight. A poem could stir blood for war, or cool it to peace. And they remembered everything. Entire epics were passed down perfectly, word for word, generation after generation. The Mongols held memory just as tightly. Their great work, The Secret History of the Mongols, started as an oral tradition before being written down. It wasn't just a list of events, it was a saga, a teaching tool. It carried the core of their culture: loyalty, vengeance, ambition, fate. It unified clans. It passed on values. Even the Scythians, who left behind almost no written words, carried their history in speech. When Greek writers like Herodotus wrote about them, they were echoing stories that had already been told aloud for centuries. Sure, oral tradition had risks. Memories could fade. Stories could change. But it had one huge strength. It stayed alive. It adapted. It traveled with the people, no matter where they went or what they lost. Empires with libraries and stone archives might collapse and crumble. But a story kept in memory could survive everything. As long as someone still breathed the words, nothing was truly lost. In many settled civilizations, women were hidden behind palace walls or silenced behind veils. Not so with nomadic cultures. Life on the move required everyone to work, and that gave women power. Real power. From the Scythians to the Mongols, archaeology and historical accounts show that women weren't just behind the scenes. They were on horseback, in council, in battle. They served as warriors, shamans, diplomats, and even clan leaders. In a world where survival was a team effort, there was no room for sidelining half the tribe. Look at the Scythians. Across the Eurasian steppe, burial sites have revealed women buried with weapons, swords, bows, armor. Their bones show signs of combat, not symbolic wounds. Real ones. These weren't decorative burials. These were fighters. Greek writers, seeing these women, were both fascinated and unnerved. They created entire myths about Amazon warriors, fierce, independent, and terrifying. But those legends weren't entirely fictional. They were reflections of something real. Women who didn't just survive in harsh nomadic life, but thrived, fought, and led. They say the Mongols descended from the steppe's earliest nomadic tribes, and that legacy showed in the roles women played. While the men were off raiding or expanding the empire, Mongol women managed the camps, keeping life running, making decisions, and holding everything together. But their power didn't stop there. At the highest levels of Mongol society, women shaped history. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law weren't tucked away in tents. They ruled territories, led troops, negotiated alliances. One of the most powerful among them, Toragene Khatan, acted as regent of the empire. And Sorkhokhtani Beki? She wasn't just a mother of emperors, she was a master strategist and kingmaker. Her influence shaped the future of the Mongol Empire from behind the scenes, and often from the front lines. Among the Bedouins, women held fewer formal leadership titles, but their influence ran deep. Through marriage alliances, poetry, and their command of hospitality, Bedouin women helped hold the fabric of the tribe together. A woman's tent was her domain, and in many tribes, she could own property, keep her own camels, and even initiate divorce. Her responsibilities weren't minor, they were central. She managed resources, raised warriors, and protected the family's honor. Spirituality also gave nomadic women a kind of power often denied in settled societies. Across the Turkic and Siberian steppes, female shamans were respected as healers, guides, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They weren't tucked away on the edges of belief, they were right at the center of it. In these cultures, necessity made room for flexibility, and that created space for women to lead, fight, heal, and rule. Nomadic life demanded adaptability. There was no room for waiting. If a man fell in battle, a woman picked up where he left off, without ritual, without permission. On the steppe or in the desert, a woman could rock the cradle and draw the bow, all in the same breath. Their spirituality matched that way of life. It wasn't locked inside temples. It moved with the people. Their gods weren't found in statues. They were in the wind, in the sky, in the silence between hoofbeats. When you're always in motion, your gods move with you. Nomadic belief systems were deeply tied to nature. They were animistic, seasonal, rooted in cycles and survival. The wind was more than a breeze. It was a message. Mountains watched over you. Rivers carried spirits. Fire was sacred, the center of every home, and often the only constant in a shifting world. The entire landscape spoke, and the nomads knew how to listen. The Scythians, as Herodotus recorded, worshipped gods tied to the natural world, goddesses of the hearth, sky gods, and others. Their rituals could include horse sacrifices and cannabis smoke, and sacred oaths were made not in temples, but beneath the open sky. They didn't need priests in golden robes, just warriors and shamans calling to the heavens with sincerity and fire. Before the rise of Islam, the Bedouins practiced a kind of local polytheism, where spirits, or jinn, were believed to dwell in rocks, winds, and desolate places. Poets and seers were said to be touched, or even possessed, by these unseen forces. Hospitality wasn't just good manners, it was a sacred duty, a spiritual act. The Mongol spiritual life was shaped by Tengrism, a belief system centered on Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't worshipped in buildings, he was the sky itself, always watching, always judging. Genghis Khan claimed his right to rule came directly from Tengri. Mongols also revered earth spirits, their ancestors' ghosts, and the sacred fire that burned in the center of every tent. Shamanism was core to Mongol life. Shamans weren't just healers or spiritual figures, they were political advisors, counselors, and links between the human and spirit worlds. What made nomadic spirituality powerful was its ability to change. As nomads encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they didn't abandon their beliefs, they adapted them. Mongol rulers often patronized several religions at once. A Bedouin could follow Islamic law and still carry the older customs of the desert. Where cities built temples to enclose their gods, nomads carried theirs with them, stitched into the fabric of their tents, woven into the stars above their heads, and spoken in the breath of memory. In the 1860s, the U.S. government kickstarted a massive construction project by offering big rewards. For every mile of railroad track built, companies were promised generous loans and up to 640 acres of public land. It wasn't just about linking the country coast to coast. It was also a race for land, money, and a place in history. What looked like a modern marvel on paper quickly turned into one of the toughest construction challenges America had ever seen. Crews would have to push through mountain ranges, stretch across vast plains, and survive blazing deserts and freezing winters. Thousands of workers, many of them immigrants, were brought in to get the job done. The payoff would be enormous, but so was the human toll. For the native nations whose land the railroad would slice through, this wasn't seen as progress. It was a threat. Back in 1862, the idea seemed like a long shot. But just 7 years later, 2 rail lines would finally meet in the desert of Utah, forever changing the country. The 2 railroads faced very different landscapes. The Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, Nebraska, had the relatively flat Great Plains in front of them. But the Central Pacific, starting from Sacramento in 1863, was immediately confronted by the brutal Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't just tall hills, they were massive granite peaks known for deadly avalanches and heavy snowfall. And this was before dynamite had even been invented. Only about 80 miles from Sacramento, the Sierras loomed like a wall. Every step forward felt like a battle against nature. At first, the Central Pacific hired mainly Irish immigrants and white workers, but many walked away, unwilling to face the harsh, punishing conditions. Desperate for manpower, the company began hiring Chinese immigrants. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese laborers were on the job, making up more than 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce. They earned lower wages, lived in more dangerous camps, and were targets of intense racism. Still, they became absolutely essential. Their determination, discipline, and skill pushed the line forward in ways nobody else could. The work was both heroic and horrifying. Using only hand tools and black powder, they bored tunnels through solid rock. Tunnel number 6 became infamous. It took nearly 2 years to finish. Winters were brutal, with snow piled 40 feet high. Workers lived in camps buried deep under the snow, connected to the outside world only by vertical shafts. Many died from rock slides, explosions, and avalanches. To keep moving, Chinese crews even lowered themselves in baskets over sheer cliffs, chipping away at rock bit by bit. When a mountain couldn't be avoided, they drilled through it. When the land dropped away, they built towering wooden bridges. It was some of the most dangerous, overlooked labor in U.S. history. There are barely any records of the individual Chinese workers. No statues, no names. But without them, the dream of a transcontinental railroad would have ended in the mountains. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally broke through the Sierras. Ahead lay the dry, deadly desert, flat and open. The worst was behind them. Now the real race to the finish could begin. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crews were heading west across the Great Plains. At first glance, it seemed easier, endless stretches of flat land. But the challenge wasn't just the terrain. It was dealing with people, politics, and power struggles. The workforce here included a mix of Irish immigrants, freedmen, and former Union soldiers, many of them looking for stable work after the Civil War. The landscape may have been less extreme than the Sierras, but the path was no less complicated. The race to connect the 2 lines was on, and every mile came with its own battle. On the wide open plains, crews could sometimes lay 2, even 3 miles of track in a single day. The flat land made for fast work, but it came at a high cost. Workers faced more than just physical exhaustion. They were constantly exposed to raids, hunger, and the harsh forces of nature. These plains weren't empty. They were home to the Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux, nations that had lived, hunted, and died on this land for generations. To them, the railroad wasn't just a line of progress cutting across the country, it was a direct threat. The tracks tore through tribal hunting grounds. The smoke and noise from trains scared off buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and survey teams disrupted sacred land. The tribes saw clearly what was coming: more settlers, soldiers, fences, and the loss of their way of life. They resisted. The Lakota Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud, struck back with force. They raided work camps, attacked surveying crews, and tore up track. In turn, the U.S. government escalated. Forts were built. Troops were stationed. Railroad work became a military operation. Track layers worked under guard, the job now part of a quiet war waged with rifles and broken promises. For indigenous nations, the railroad spelled the end, and they were right. Still, the Union Pacific kept going. Backed by heavy federal loans and driven by men like Thomas Durant, the company laid rail at a furious pace. Temporary towns known as Hell on Wheels sprang up wherever the crews stopped. Places full of drinking, gambling, and violence, gone as quickly as they appeared. By 1867, they had reached Cheyenne and were pushing into Wyoming. The mountains were up ahead, but the real climb was moral. How do you build a nation while burying another beneath it? For Union Pacific, the answer was blunt: keep laying track and don't look back. We often hear about the Transcontinental Railroad through stories of golden spikes and important men in suits. But the true story is something else entirely. It's written in sweat, built by muscle, and soaked in pain. The ones who made it happen were often forgotten, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked, their stories hidden beneath the rails. On the Central Pacific side, it was the Chinese laborers, almost 15,000 of them, mostly from Guangdong, who did what many thought was impossible. They endured the freezing winds of the Sierra Nevada, deadly accidents, and constant discrimination. Paid less than white workers and housed in worse conditions, they kept working anyway. Quietly, precisely, relentlessly. At first, many doubted them, saying they were too weak, too small. But the Chinese workers quickly proved otherwise. They drilled, blasted, built, and cooked their own food. In fact, they often stayed healthier than others on the job. And yet, when the last spike was hammered into the ground at Promontory Point, not one of them was invited to the ceremony. They didn't even appear in the official photograph. Over on the Union Pacific, the Irish made up much of the workforce. Many had fled famine or survived war only to face new dangers on the plains. They laid track fast, fought off attacks, and drank hard in flimsy tents when the day was done. Life was rough, but their work was vital. Formerly enslaved African Americans also joined the labor force, hired as freed men hoping for better lives. Their contributions, too, were mostly ignored. Like the Chinese and the Irish, they were exploited, and yet the railroad wouldn't have been built without them. This was more than a construction project. It was a multinational effort built by people with bare hands and aching backs. And it wasn't just the ones laying rails. There were cooks, blacksmiths, wagon drivers, and supply haulers. Each played a part in keeping everything moving. They weren't the ones in charge. But without them, there would have been no progress at all. Without their labor, there would be no golden spike, no grand American railroad myth to celebrate. We often focus on the tycoons and visionaries, but tracks weren't laid by ambition alone. They were laid by tired hands, by underpaid men, by workers pushed to the margins. These were people who changed history without ever knowing if anyone would remember their names. They didn't build the railroad for fame, they built it because they had to. By the late 1860s, construction had turned into a fierce rivalry. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific weren't just laying tracks anymore, they were locked in a race. Somewhere in the Utah Territory, they would meet. But this wasn't some friendly handshake deal. It was a cutthroat competition over land, money, and national prestige. Government subsidies fueled the madness. For every mile completed, companies got loans and federal land. That meant more track meant more profit. Both sides pushed to outdo the other, sometimes even building parallel lines that everyone knew only one company would get to keep. It got ridiculous. Tracks laid simply for the payout, not for any real use. Speed became everything. The Central Pacific, having conquered the Sierras, charged through the Nevada and Utah deserts. The Union Pacific, starting from the east, crossed rivers and open plains and scraped past the Rockies. They laid rails through remote areas just to stake a claim before anyone called it unnecessary. The work was nonstop. In April 1869, Chinese workers with the Central Pacific broke a world record, 10 miles of track in a single day. Even now, that record stands. It was done with tightly choreographed teams, perfect timing, and sheer endurance. Not to be left behind, Union Pacific crews pushed forward despite constant challenges, labor strikes, poor supply lines, and chaos at the top. Their financier, Thomas Durant, seemed more focused on stock profits than on actually building a railroad. But the line kept moving. At last, both tracks neared a meeting point, Promontory Summit, in what's now Utah. Surveyors agreed on the spot. Plans for a public ceremony began. 2 locomotives, Jupiter from the Central Pacific and number 119 from the Union Pacific, were rolled out, nose to nose. Executives polished their speeches. A special golden spike was crafted, engraved with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the 2 great oceans of the world." To make it even grander, telegraph wires were linked to the ceremonial hammer so each strike could be heard across the nation in real time. But beneath all the speeches and celebration, a harder truth lingered. The race had been ruthless, reckless at times, and completely profit-driven. The rails were now joined, but the damage left behind, on people, land, and history, wouldn't fade. Generations would carry those scars. And still, on May 10, 1869, the windswept plateau of Promontory Summit became the heart of the country. Journalists, railroad executives, workers, and spectators stood together to witness the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. 2 locomotives gleamed, face to face, with a final rail between them. The golden spike waited at the center, ready to be driven in. Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, stepped forward to finish the job. A moment that had cost so much for so many was finally here. As Leland Stanford raised the sledgehammer for the final blow, people across the country held their breath. With each strike, the telegraph clicked, "Done." Church bells rang. Cannons roared. Celebrations broke out from coast to coast, from New York to San Francisco. In that moment, it felt like the entire country had been sewn together. What once took months could now be done in 7 days. The East and West were no longer distant strangers. They were finally connected. It was a jaw-dropping engineering feat. The United States, still finding its footing after the Civil War, had just proven that it could physically and symbolically reconnect its fractured parts. Steel and steam now tied the nation into a single line stretching from ocean to ocean. But the story told that day was carefully staged. None of the Chinese workers who had laid most of the Central Pacific's track were invited to the ceremony. They were left out of the photo, ignored at the moment of triumph. So were the Irish laborers, the freedmen, the native guides, and the countless others who had done the hardest work. Instead, the image captured a lineup of well-dressed men, beards, hammers, cigars, posing in their place. While the country celebrated unity, the truth was more complicated. The railroad did connect the coasts, but it also deepened the divisions between race, class, and culture. Markets were united, but many lives had been broken along the way. That famous photo shows a clean, triumphant ending. But the real story? It was buried beneath the tracks. The completion of the railroad didn't just shrink distances. It supercharged the economy. Overnight, the U.S. changed from a 2-coast nation separated by wilderness into one connected system, humming with movement and trade. What used to take weeks or months by wagon or ship could now move across the country in a matter of days. Midwestern crops, wheat, corn, cattle, could head west to hungry mining towns or east to growing cities. Factories sent goods in the other direction. Rail cars replaced wagons, steam engines replaced sails. The frontier wasn't just a vast unknown anymore. It was a booming supply chain. Towns began popping up along the rail lines, growing almost instantly. Some flourished into cities. Others faded as quickly as they came, especially when the route changed. Still, each town was a stop on this ever-growing network, linked by the constant hiss of steam and clang of iron. The railroad also kicked industry into overdrive. Iron foundries, coal mines, and lumber mills all exploded with new demand. Steel barons got richer. Railroad magnates gained power. Banks profited. Small business owners took advantage, opening stores, inns, and saloons near the tracks. The mail moved faster. News crossed the country in days instead of weeks. And for the first time, the U.S. government could really project power across the entire continent, sending troops, supplies, and orders anywhere the rails reached. And then there were the people. Millions headed west. Immigrants who once arrived in New York now had a clear route to jobs and land in California, Oregon, and beyond. Homesteaders chased opportunity. Prospectors hunted gold. Ranchers chased open space. Outlaws chased trouble. They all rode the same rails into what they hoped was a better future. Of course, the boom came with a price. Wealth flowed upward. Native lands were swallowed. Laborers stayed poor. But no one could deny what had happened. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't just connect a nation, it transformed it. The engine pulled more than people. It pulled money, power, and ambition, and once it started, there was no stopping it. Beneath the gleaming rails and the proud headlines celebrating the Transcontinental Railroad, a far darker legacy was unfolding, one marked by the loss of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. While the nation celebrated its new coast-to-coast connection, the tracks themselves cut deep through native homelands, tearing into the ancestral territories of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many others. What had once been sacred ground and open plains was soon divided by steel, telegraph wires, and fences. Each railroad spike driven into the soil chipped away at native sovereignty. The impact was swift and devastating. Central to the lives and survival of many plains tribes, the buffalo were slaughtered in staggering numbers. These animals weren't just a food source, they were spiritual symbols and a foundation of tribal economies. But with the arrival of the railroad, buffalo were driven toward extinction. Passengers were even encouraged to shoot them for sport from the comfort of moving trains. The railroad didn't just bring tracks, it brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns sprang up in places where none had existed before. Homesteaders, backed by federal land policies, claimed plots that belonged to tribal nations. Treaties that had once promised protection meant little. The railroad consumed what those agreements had not. And when tribes resisted, the response was military. Garrisons were set up along the tracks to protect construction and enforce settler claims. What followed was a series of brutal conflicts. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others fought back in what became known as wars to some and massacres to others. From Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, these weren't just fights over territory, they were battles over identity, existence, and survival. Eventually, resistance was crushed. Tribes were forced onto reservations, often far from their homelands. The psychological damage ran deep. Sacred places were defiled. Centuries-old migration patterns were broken. Cultures built around movement and vast spaces were suddenly confined and monitored. It was all done in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was hailed as a triumph of American willpower and technology. But it came at the cost of countless indigenous dreams. What tore through the landscape wasn't just iron, it was the dismantling of entire ways of life, replaced by timetables and timber. History books often praise the railroad for uniting the United States. But for native peoples, it shattered their nations. When that final golden spike was hammered into place at Promontory Summit in 1869, it marked not only the completion of a grand project, but the dawn of a new, faster, hungrier American identity, one driven by steel and steam. The railroad didn't just shrink the map. It reshaped the way Americans lived. A journey that once took half a year could now be made in a single week. The movement of people, goods, and information accelerated overnight. The very meaning of distance changed. It sparked the rise of time zones, invented to coordinate train schedules across the continent. Farmers could now sell their crops far beyond local markets. Cities and industries grew, fed by raw materials shipped in from thousands of miles away. The rhythm of daily life began to echo the relentless pace of the trains themselves. Culturally, the railroad gave life to the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that America was meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Expansion no longer felt like a dream, it felt like a guarantee. With rails stretching through mountains, deserts, and prairies, nothing seemed out of reach anymore. Everything could be touched, settled, owned. But along with that expansion came a new model of corporate power. The railroad wasn't just a symbol of progress. It became a foundation for concentrated wealth and industrial influence. It set the stage for a new kind of America, connected, powerful, and increasingly controlled by the hands that laid the track. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington didn't just walk away wealthy, they rewrote the rules of power. They shaped national policy, bought influence in Congress, and built personal empires from steel and smoke. Scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair revealed just how deeply the railroad companies had embedded themselves into government, turning public funds into private fortunes. For workers, the tracks were a double-edged sword. They offered jobs and a chance to build something lasting, but also brought exploitation, low wages, and dangerous conditions. For indigenous peoples, the railroad wasn't just a project. It was the final blow to a world that had already been under siege. For the environment, it meant upheaval. Forests were cleared, rivers were bridged, and the buffalo, once numbering in the millions, were almost wiped out. And yet, despite everything it cost, the railroad did something no other force had done. It tied the country together. It gave immigrants a path to new beginnings. It connected businesses to customers, governments to far-off territories, and people to possibility. It changed the shape of the nation, not just physically, but politically, economically, and culturally. The iron rails didn't just carry passengers. They carried dreams, destruction, ambition, and arrogance. The railroad was a marvel, and it was a wound. It was a victory and a loss. When the two locomotives finally met in the Utah desert, cow-catchers touching, golden spike-driven, the United States was forever changed. Not by war, not by election, but by steel, sweat, and the fire in a boiler. The transformation wasn't just national, it was total. The modern America we know began not with a bang or a speech, but with the sound of a hammer striking iron.